I can't understand why we keep coming up with these ideas for energy sources which underneath it have a long-term major pollution problem. We're in real trouble, I think, in lots of ways, but there's always been this thing about the territory and opportunity. And there's a genuine possibility, I think, that independents will have a balance of power situation, and so some real change might be possible.
Graeme Sawyer, thanks for joining us on the Next Gen North podcast.
Pleasure.
How was your Territory Day?
Oh, pretty quiet, managing dogs.
Oh, right. So,
but, a little bit of stuff around the neighbourhood with fireworks and stuff. It was good.
Yeah,
but it's a great night.
How did they cope, the dogs?
Yeah, they were pretty good. I was surprised, actually. I locked them in the shed, basically, and then had a peek through the crack to see how they were going at one stage. And the main sort of dog who sort of leads the others was lying on the ground asleep. So I thought, yep, we're good.
Coping all right. Now, you're a long-time Territorian. Are things like Territory Day, what makes the place special, or at the very least, unique to this part of the world?
Yeah, look, I think Territory Day adds a unique layer, but it's the actual broader environment and stuff, and I think a fairly unique Territory perspective on life that makes it the Territory for me, but that's sort of reflected in part in some aspects of Territory Day.
Yeah. So is that what brought you to the Territory, was the the unique environment and way of life up here, or where are you from originally? Right?
Yeah, pretty much. Look, it was a funny story in some respects. So I was a country kid from Western Victoria.
Right.
Grew up in a small town called Hamilton. But both parents had relatives on farms near Horsham, so we spent a lot of time as kids on the farm and loved it, being in the bush. But Hamilton was pretty small, so we're often in the bush around the fringes as well.
Yeah.
Shouldn't talk about the things we got up to, but it was so when you're growing up in that environment, you often get into fishing and shooting and that sort of stuff.
Sure.
So I came to Darwin on a holiday first in '79. My older brother was up here, and we came up on the old Garn to Alice and then on a bus to Darwin. We pulled into Adelaide River early morning for breakfast, and I was chatting with a bus driver and said, "Oh, what are you up to?" And I said, "Oh, we're going to Darwin. Brother's coming up to pick me up. He just lives up the road there." And I said, "Oh, who's that?" I said, "Oh, Bruce Sawyer." And he said, "Oh, I'll drop you off on the way past if you like." So we got off the bus and walked into Bruce's house just on the edge of the highway there. And he was just getting ready to come into town and pick us up, basically.
Yeah, right.
So the other two, they went to bed and I went to work with Bruce. I shot my first feral pig about half an hour later, and we caught barramundi in the river that night, and I was sort of thinking, wow, this is pretty special.
Yeah, right.
And then getting out and about in the environment and just the river and the crocodiles and all the rest of it, I was sort of hooked. So I went back to Hamilton, and this must have been fate, I think. I was back 3 days, back at work at the sports stadium that I was assistant manager of, and we just had ladies' squash morning, which was chaos and pandemonium. It's this pre-organised child bonding and childcare, etc. So imagine this huge big shed, like it's massive. It's had 2 big basketball courts, 4 squash courts, the show court basketball court, 10 table tennis areas up the other end. So it's just this huge big tin shed. A couple of maybe 80-odd people in there. And the idea was, while you were playing squash, the other mums would look after your kids.
Right.
The reality was, while the mums all sat out the front and had coffees and in those days smoked and chatted, the kids ran riot up and down the stadium, and the noise was something else again, like it was like a rock concert almost. They'd all just gone home, and I opened the newspaper while I was having my lunch, and there, looking at me on page 3, was an ad to come to the Northern Territory and do your graduate diploma in education with a guaranteed job on the other end. So I was back up here a month later.
Great. Wow, how good's that? Guaranteed work. So that was you say it was the late 70s, was it?
Yeah.
So that was, would have been just post Tracy then.
Yes.
Oh, well, I guess a
couple of years after.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how was Darwin, rebuilding, and was it sort of on the way, or was there still work to be done at that stage?
Look, there was still work to be done. I mean, all the remnants of Tracy had been cleaned up pretty much.
Yep.
But there were lots of areas like Malac and places like that where the rebuilding was, the new suburbs were just being laid out, and so I did that graduate diploma at the community college in 1980, and people have a party, and there were no sort of street maps or apps to tell you where they were, and you're going out into places like Malac where there's these sort of dirt things in the middle of things that are roads, and trying to find places was pretty funny.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was pretty raw.
Yep. So how was being a teacher in those days in the top end? Did you
Oh,
enjoy
look,
it?
I loved it. Yeah, I was. It was fantastic. I mean, getting kids engaged in stuff and making them enjoy what they were doing, and then seeing the response you got was incredibly rewarding. And it was a lot of fun.
Yeah. How long were you actually a teacher for?
Yeah, look, I was only a classroom teacher for a couple of years, and then I got engaged with technology stuff. I still remember it. We had a staff meeting at Darwin Primary School just over here in the Frog Hollow, and the principal asked if there's anyone amongst the staff who'd had any experience with computers. And nobody on staff even knew what he was talking about except me, and I'd had very limited experience with a computer, which in those days was pencil marks on a card that you slipped into a slot.
Right.
And what had happened was the parent council at Darwin Primary School was pretty progressive, had a lot of people who worked in the Department of Education and public servants as their sort of base, because in those days there were hardly any kids left in the city.
Right.
And they were all dropped off on the parents' way to work type stuff.
Yep.
So they'd wanted to get this computer stuff happening in their school, so they'd bought a couple of Apple II Plus computers and wanted someone to play with it.
Yep.
So I put my hand up and said, well, I'm happy to have a play with this and see what happens.
Yep.
And I got some really startling results from kids out of it. And like when you look back now at how basic those things were and the things we were playing with, it's quite strange. But that led me to going into a specialist position in Waggaman.
Mm-hmm.
And then the year after that, I went into an advisory position in the education department around the use of computer technology and learning environments.
Right.
And we were basically playing around with database technology and scaffolding learning environments, for want of a technical term. And it was a huge amount of fun and really interesting. And I reckon that was close to one of the best jobs around in those days, was being the advisory position. You travelled all over the NT, got to work with kids in schools doing really fun things. It was a really funny one when they opened one of the schools in Palmerston. We'd trained the kids in the use of a thing called HyperCard, where they were making me stacks, which is sort of like what a Facebook page is almost nowadays. But the kids had made all this stuff, and you put a photo of yourself in and an audio recording, and then this little card was there with you on it. So when all the dignitaries were arriving for the visit, the kids were meeting them at the door, getting their details, sitting them down, taking a photo, and then they'd walk them across the library to this other computer and show them this card and ask them if they wanted to do an audio. Well, these senior bureaucrats in the education department were petrified. They did not have a clue what was going on, and to see these kids doing this sort of stuff, they were just wondering what the hell had hit them.
So
it was
Facebook,
so good.
Facebook stole your idea, is what you're saying.
Yeah, if only.
So are you still involved in the technological side of thing, IT? Are you still involved with education? You know, where did that sort of progress to?
Yeah, so look, I still am. One of the things that was funny, the database system that we were looking to play with, so I wanted to really push the envelope with the idea of these databases being used to scaffold learning.
Yep.
And so we needed a database that would do that in a way that was customised to fit what you needed to happen in a classroom rather than pure database technology.
Right.
So we built this thing, and we had to have subject material, and it was a toss-up between a history database and a wildlife database. And my personal passion for wildlife, I was the one making the decisions, so it was easy. We built the NT Animals Information System, it was called. And it was basically the first of the picture database systems. So you had info on all the animals, photographs of them.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the starting point for that. But it got me into the technology sphere around databases more and more. And so when I left the education department and went to work for Quantum Multimedia Centre, that was a lot of work on databases, and we transitioned into database technologies being used in, well, nowadays it's called cloud computing, but in those days it was just an online database.
Yep.
So you basically put your database there and then you built an HTML front end to it. And the spin-off out of that was Entity One Proprietary Limited, which is a business that I've been part owner of and manager of for the last 20-odd years, which builds cloud-based computing systems, for want of a better term,
Yep.
and a bit of multimedia stuff and things like that. So that's still one of the things that pays the mortgage.
Yep. So it keeps you busy.
Yeah.
Yep. So how then, you mentioned the environmental passion you had before. Was it your time in Victoria, or was it your time in the Territory, or was it sort of a combination of all those things culminating into your love for the wildlife and sustainability and that sort of thing?
Yeah, look, I think it obviously started young. So Mum was very much into the joys of the natural environment, and growing up in a place like Hamilton, you know, the block or the house block was sort of, well, 4 times the size of a Darwin house block. So, you know, you had the veggie garden and you had the garden and you had lots of wildlife, and you also had chooks and pigeons and you name it. But also being on the farm a lot, you got to see the wildlife stuff as well. But obviously I was into it. I just saw the other day, I was flicking through some files, and there's a certificate from the Gould League of Victoria when I was in grade 4 at primary school, awarded for my work on planting trees.
Right, so there you go.
So some things haven't changed much. So I think that was always in the sort of learnings from an early age, and then hitting the Territory, I think that just exploded.
Yeah.
And then when we did that NT Animals project, I'd met a guy called Ian Morris, who's our most amazing naturalist and just an absolute freak in terms of his knowledge of both Indigenous and Western scientific knowledge about wildlife. I mean, he's a consultant that works with Attenborough and all those film crews and whatever, but he's just got this amazing knowledge. And I was lucky enough to team up with him, and we've been good friends ever since. And so I've learnt an enormous amount of stuff from him as well.
Yep. So teaming up with Ian, was that what led to FrogWatch and those sorts of initiatives? Or how, what sort of work have you done with Ian?
Yeah, so a million things really in that sense. But yeah, we were working on the NT Animals database stuff, and we'd shown it to a whole bunch of people, including people at CSIRO and stuff, and they all went, what the hell? How do you do this? Where did this come from? Because no one had seen those sort of things.
Even in CSIRO?
Yeah, not back then. So this was mid to late 80s. So, you know, a database with pictures in it and high-res pictures. I mean, you couldn't do it on a PC in those days. You had to have a Macintosh, which was part of the problem. Because CSIRO didn't have Macintoshes and stuff like that. So we were talking to all those sort of people, and then Mike Tyler, who was Australia's frog guru, he was good friends with Ian, and I'd met him through that, and he asked us to chase up some frog stuff up here, because in those days we didn't even know what species we had, let alone their distributions.
Right.
And there was a disease called chytrid fungus, which was wiping out frog species in other parts of the world and in the East Coast, and they wanted to know whether it was happening up here. So we set out to start doing some of that, and then FrogWatch was formed basically to sort of formalise that and promote it a bit.
Yep. And
then that grew into a whole bunch of community activity and a lot of publicity and stuff, which then grew into the ToadBusters phenomenon.
Yep.
And so, yeah, that came out of that relationship with Ian.
Yeah. So the ToadBusters thing, I think a lot of people, know your public profile as a ToadBuster. I know, I remember the days of you with the spotlight on your head and, trying to get everyone out to go and, try and stem the tide of cane toads. Can you tell us a little bit about, what was the impetus for that? Because I guess just a personal anecdote that I mentioned before, I was born in Darwin 87, moved to Tennant in 92, came back to Darwin in 2000. And in 2000, I was living in Parap, and I just about remember up every single tree was a frill-necked lizard, and in the space of maybe 5 to 10 years, there were none. And that's, I guess, coincided with the incursion of cane toads.
Absolutely, it was caused by cane toads, and it's one of the things that I found fascinating. Like, I'd read and seen and heard and talked to lots of experts and stuff about cane toads, and I had a little bit of knowledge of what had happened in Queensland. But one of the problems was a lot of that stuff had been happening for a long time, and a lot of the scientists and stuff weren't paying much attention to it. And so I remember being on the National Toad Task Force, and there was all this talk about the impact of cane toads, and all these scientists going, there's no evidence of that. And I said, what do you mean there's no evidence of that? And I said, well, there's no evidence of that.
As in there's nothing to worry about? Or?
No. What that actually means, when you get to understand it, is there's no scientific peer-reviewed published literature.
Ah, I see.
So I had a fascinating conversation one night with Hal Cogger, who's one of the reptile gurus of Australia from the Australian Museum. He's written the big Bible on reptiles, and Hal was filling my head with stories about how bad cane toads were, and he'd been to Hawaii with the early CSIRO teams looking at them and everything like that. But then I said, Hal, you've written this reptile guide document, which was the status of Australian reptiles, and there's nothing in there about cane toads. So if a ranger in Kakadu is looking at what they should be doing about reptile stuff, they're likely to read your document,
Sure.
but it doesn't mention cane toads. How come? And he said, well, when you do a scientific publication like that, you have to refer to peer-reviewed literature.
Yep.
And this stuff that I know about toads isn't in the peer-reviewed literature. And I went, how dumb's that? But what happened was during that task force sitting period, Mary Oakwood published the first piece of research on the impact of cane toads, which was on quolls in Kakadu National Park.
Right.
So a lot of the stuff that happened in Queensland had happened before anything, and nobody had sort of got in front of the toad population move and done a scientific study of what was going on.
Yep.
So Mary published this document, and I remember these scientists going, holy hell, this is terrible. And I've gone, guys, you only had to open your eyes to know this was terrible for a long time. And now suddenly you've got one little piece of scientific stuff.
Yep.
And that was one of the key problems.
So it's building that evidence base? Is that sort of what you're
Well, yeah,
referring
but
to?
it's also this perverse thing where in areas where it suits people, particularly policymakers, unless you've got scientific evidence to back it up, it doesn't happen. It's not there, or it's not real.
Yep.
But perverse to that is if you look at things like climate change, when you have got scientific evidence and you still don't want to know it, they still manage to fob it off and ignore it. So there's a much more complex problem underneath it. But I was really flabbergasted at the lack of scientific rigour around this problem. And talking to a lot of these experts from down south, they had some pretty big concerns. So Mike Tyler, for example, who was the sort of grandfather of frog research in Australia, he told me that he thought cane toads would be at their worst in the top end in Kakadu of anywhere in their entire range just because of the conditions.
Lots of water?
Lots of water, lots of heat. So
Okay.
in Australia, where cane toads have moved south down the east coast, their range is limited by temperature in the winter and all that sort of stuff. But it also means they're much less robust. So you've got much less numbers.
Yep.
Whereas up here, there aren't any constraints on that sort of stuff. There's no heat issue for them all year round. There's plenty of water. So there's a whole bunch of issues like that. And that's where we've seen toads devastate the ecosystems. And like you're saying about frillnecks, that's happened with varanids or some varanids, especially the big guys like panoptes and stuff.
What are they?
The yellow-spotted monitors, big goannas.
Right.
So they've taken out, and what's interesting, and we don't have any research on this stuff, but research all around the world shows that predators are really important in ecosystems.
Yep.
So they shape the ecosystems, they control all sorts of things, and there's famous examples of the wolves in Yellowstone as an example.
Yeah.
But in Australia, a lot of that key predator role, particularly in amongst the native stuff, is reptiles.
Right.
So goannas are a really important keystone predator in that sense. And so you take them out of the environment, what happens? Well, we're starting to see lots of those sorts of things. And there's quite a few insidious elements to that.
Right.
Some of them are sort of impacting in Darwin. People complain about orange-footed scrubfowls making a mess in their gardens way, way, way more now than it used to be.
Right.
And that's because their key predator is gone.
Yep.
So a lot of the eggs in the nests and stuff are eaten by goannas back in the day.
Yep.
The masked lapwings are the same, and the bush thick-knees and stuff are the same as well. Well, people think, it's nice having a lot of them around, but there's actually issues with that because, like, if something like bird flu hits Darwin, it'll go through it like a dose of salts because the population is way over the top in terms of numbers.
Yep.
And the predation's not there. So typically when you have a disease outbreak or something like that, as animals get sick, they're the ones that predators clean up first.
Yep.
And that helps limit those sorts of things to a degree. I mean, with major viruses like bird flu, maybe it doesn't help that much, but they're the sort of mechanisms that are built into ecology to help, and we've lost all that up here.
Yep.
And what the implications of that are is still unfolding. Some of them are really looking quite severe, but there's no real research around it.
Yeah. So are the local species showing any signs of adaptation, or is that something that sort of happens over the eons? How do we Can we quantify that at all?
Yeah, look, it's a really fascinating one, and one that I'm trying to do some work on right now. So we are seeing pockets of persistence, and we don't really understand why that is. So there is a thing called taste aversion, where a bit like you go out to the pub and get pissed on gin, you might never drink gin again. But if you, as an animal, eat something that makes you sick, then you probably don't go near it again.
Sure.
And that may be what's happening here. So you get animals that survive their first experience.
Yep.
And why that happens, we don't really know. But there's a potential for some of it to be genetic.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you've got resistance, and without going into details here, there's some genetic structures that give animals the ability to eat toads.
Right.
So other parts of the world where toads are common or their relatives are common, there's a whole bunch of animals that can eat them. And if you look at the goannas in the Philippines, for example, they're about 3,000 times more resistant to toad toxin than ours are. So maybe there's snippets of that happening here, and that particular animal has got a bit of resistance, and so we'll never touch a toad again.
Mm-hmm.
And that could then potentially be passed on if it's genetic. But if it's just behavioural and they were lucky and got one that was
not as toxic.
Like if it's been killed on the road, for example,
the
vets tell me that the toxin loses its toxicity quite quickly.
Right.
And there's also a mechanism in toads when they express their venom or the toxin in their glands that it mixes with another chemical which makes it much more toxic.
Right.
If they get killed by a car, maybe there's no time for that to happen. So if I come along and eat that animal, I might get sick, but I won't die. I might learn not touching that again. So could be that. We don't really know. But with some animals, like frillnecks, seem to be on a bit of a bounce back at the minute, but not anything like what they used to be, and it's still quite localised. So whether that goes through, so when we started doing the goanna research in 2012, there's quite a healthy population of goannas on the Casuarina Coastal Reserve and CDU campus. We microchipped about 52, I think, in the first 4 or 5 years, which was a real surprise. But now they're all dead and gone. And, you know, those animals have been living with toads for quite some time.
Right.
And so understanding why they suddenly crashed was part of our research. And it seems to be, it's not just toads, it's the profile of your toad population. So where you've got small cane toads in an environment, you're losing reptiles differently to where you've just got big adults.
Okay.
And basically you start losing your juveniles.
Yeah.
And when that happens, your whole population's in trouble.
Yep.
So that's the sort of stuff that we've seen happen in Darwin when we thought maybe they were okay. And when you first do that study and you see them, 50-odd of them in that space, you think, oh, well, they're all right.
Yep.
But now,
it's
10 years later,
it's going to
they're
change
gone.
over time, isn't it? Because as the juvenile toads get bigger, the frillies can't eat the big ones, but they can eat the small ones, or and then it sort of impacts them in that way.
Yeah. So and I think you get adults through that experience where they've had a event, they got sick, don't touch them anymore, but their offspring are still vulnerable.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting one, and it's one that needs some research because there's a whole bunch of genetic things that might be able to be done to fix this.
Okay.
So Andrew Pask and some of the guys that are researching a gene tool called CRISPR think they might be able to make things like quolls resistant to toad toxin.
Right.
And suddenly you've got the idea of a native animal being a predator of toads rather than just avoiding them.
Yep.
And that could potentially make a huge difference.
Yep.
But, you know, quolls were virtually wiped out by cane toads. On the mainland they have been pretty much.
Yep.
So there's some really interesting stuff in that space around where this might go. But, you know, governments don't pay any priority to it because it's environmental, not agricultural. So
it's not going to get
difficult
votes.
for them to get funding and stuff, but I'm still hopeful that we'll be able to push through on some of those things and we'll actually get a toad solution in place eventually because a guy called Mark Tizard at CSIRO that's working on this gene stuff, potentially they can turn all cane toads male.
Wow.
And that would crash the population in 15 years. So there's a whole bunch of things like that that really, in my opinion, should have some serious attention paid to them, but they're just drifting along in background at the moment.
Yep. And it's not a remedy just to introduce the Filipino goanna, and we go around on this merry-go-round of invasive species.
Old nursery rhyme, Look, no, but you know, one of the things that is really interesting is finding out the genes, and I think they now know what those genes are. So instead of bringing in one of those varanas from the Philippines, we might be able to just slip the couple of genes relevant to that into Panoptes.
Yeah, wow.
And that would be amazing to get those big animals back in numbers across our systems and to get those ecosystem functions back again.
Yep.
So one of the things that's interesting, and the research has not been done, but Aboriginal people in Arnhem Land, for example, hunt the Buckingham Plains with fire. And that pushes everything down the burrows
Yep.
that the Panoptes have dug, and dug lots of them. So there's used to be hundreds and hundreds of these burrows across the floodplains. And then the old man was showing me, you put your hand down with your back of your hand flat on the ground and the snakes can't bite you, he reckons. I wasn't going to test his theory, but they get snakes, goannas, you name it, comes out of those burrows. And so that was a hunting technique they used because all the animals on the floodplain are using those burrows as refuges from fire. So what happens when all those burrows are gone? Where do all those animals go when there's a bushfire? And so talking to people like Mark Lamble, who does wildlife docos up here, and he comes back every sort of 10 years and does a major documentary, they documented massive declines of animals on places like the South Alligator floodplain.
So it just shows you, or just demonstrates that food chain. Sort
and
of
all these
thing.
complex interactions about what's causing what.
Yeah.
And so there was some research published recently from down south on wombat burrows. It showed something like 30 or 40 different species of animals that use wombat burrows as refuges, escape from fire, other things. And I did some work up here with a research scientist, Sean Doody. He was studying goanna stuff. And they found something like 30-odd species of animals that were using goanna burrows in various ways.
Yeah.
So it's that sort of flow-on effect through the ecosystem that we really don't have a handle on. And unfortunately in the last 20 years it's been playing out right across the place, and I think it's a really key part of our biodiversity loss. But we'll maybe never get the research done because it's possibly too late now.
Well, is doing that sort of gene splicing, I guess, for the lack of a better is that type of thing really complex and really expensive? You know, is that sort of what's holding it back?
No, I don't think it is, and that's part of the issue. So Mark Tizard had a PhD student working on this stuff, and they apparently did it. So, and if you want to look it up, there's a thing called CRISPR, C-R-I-S-P-R.
I've heard of CRISPR, but
gene editing tool that's used in medicine, lots of places.
It seems to get associated with like the communist government, you know, making
clones,
hybrid people and all this crazy. I don't know how much.
So a lot of the new cancer treatments and stuff, as I understand it, they'll take some of your blood cells, they'll modify them with CRISPR and put them back.
Right.
And that modification makes them recognise the cancer and attack your cancers.
Right.
So one of the things that happens is the cancer avoids or it hides from your immune system effectively.
Right.
So what this does is wakes it up. But there's lots of other uses in medicine and stuff where this, and you know, the patents on CRISPR were worth billions.
Right.
So it doesn't seem like it's that big a deal.
Yep.
And once you've got it sorted and you release what's called a gene drive, which is an animal that's had this modification, all of its offspring inherit that gene. So normally with sexual reproduction you get half-half between your mother and your father.
Yep.
With CRISPR involved you get 100% inheritance
Is that right?
of that gene.
Wow.
So that way it can punch itself through a population over time. And I said to Mark Tizard when he was talking about this initially, when you do it, can you also modify the gene that controls the colour of their eye so we can tell which one's modified and which one's not? Because if we could get out there and remove a lot of the male toads
Yep.
and just leave it to the doctored ones to breed, then the next generation, virtually all the offspring would be male.
Wow.
And you crash your population really fast. So I don't think it's that complex. Obviously it's complex with the scientific stuff that needs doing, but once you know how to do these things and have the tools and technologies,
Yep.
it may not be that difficult. So they're the sorts of things that I just wish the environment people and governments and stuff would prioritise, because it seems to me as a way of fixing what's a massive problem across North Australia.
Yep. Have our efforts into slowing the incursion of toads, has it been impactful at all, or is there...
Yeah, look, it's a hard one to get a definitive answer on, but I think it's very clear that around places like Darwin it's made a real difference.
Mm-hmm.
So Darwin's never been fully flooded with toads. Parts of it have been.
Yeah, I've lived in perhaps Stuart Park for most of my time since coming back, and I haven't really seen that many toads.
Yeah.
You get the odd one. Yeah.
But if you live down near the Botanic Gardens golf links, or if you live along Rapid Creek and places like that, you'll get a lot of toads. But because we don't have that, and the data that we got out of the FrogWatch stuff, so in a normal cane toad population in the wild, you got about 50% sub-adult. In Darwin, that was as low as 7%. And the difference, I'm sure, was people activity stopping toad breeding in Darwin. And there's also the food competition thing. Like I've got a photograph of stomach contents that a goanna regurgitated when we caught it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's exactly the same food items as I've got in autopsy photos of cane toads.
Right.
Though on a place like Lee Point, you've got these 12 young goannas that we found out there 18 months ago when we did their last survey, and they were all quite young. And since then, we've taken nearly 1,000 cane toads off East Point. Now, there's direct food competition between those young goannas and cane toads. So by taking the cane toads out of the way, you're improving the chances of those young goannas to survive and grow.
Yep.
Unfortunately, when they get big enough, they seem to kill themselves eating a cane toad still, so we're not getting much in terms of larger adults.
Yep.
But there's still cycling of a population. So understanding that properly, and so I think it's definitely does make a difference, and that's why we encourage people to keep doing it. If it's just the fact that the food supply is more available to native wildlife if toads are gone out of your local area for the next few months.
Yeah, because it's not just animals eating cane toads, it's not having enough food available to reproduce and just survive, basically.
Yeah, so cane toads are listed for 3 reasons as a key threatening process under our federal legislation. So because they kill native predators, because they eat lots of stuff. So, you've got small snakes and small lizards and other things cruising around in a cane toad's area, and the cane toad will eat them. And also then just food competition with other species. So species that don't have a direct competition with cane toads necessarily, but the food supply stuff makes a real difference.
Right. Mate, that's fascinating stuff. It's and it's something I think we need to give more focus on. So your public profile that you built, through FrogWatch and ToadBusters and these sorts of things, do you think that helped with your, transition into politics, because you were Darwin's Lord Mayor, I think it was 2008 to 2012? Yep. How did you find that? What was your motivation for, throwing your hat in the ring? And
yeah, that's quite a funny story too. A friend of my brother's, who I'd met through my work in education too, Gary Lambert, used to be the principal at Batchelor in those days. So I knew Gary pretty well. We were sort of friends, but mainly through my brother. He rang me up one day. He was on council, and I think he became acting mayor after George Brown died. He rang me up one day, and I was down south on holidays. He said, "You're going to stand for Lord Mayor?" And I laughed at him and said, "You got rocks in your head, mate." And he said, "When are you back?" And I said, "Next week." He said, "Okay, well, we'll have coffee and I'll convince you," which he did. And I didn't have a clue what it would actually be a real prospect, but I thought, we'll float the idea and see what happens. And of course, I won and then got into that role for the next few years.
Yep.
Very, very interesting, and had some fantastic experiences and some really frustrating aspects to that work as well, which sort of meant when I didn't get re-elected, I said to people that I think I now know how an SKP feels when they've jumped the prison wall and they're running off into the bush.
Yeah.
But there were aspects of that job which I really loved and found really interesting. But the big problem was that the local government up here doesn't have the powers to make a difference in a lot of the areas that were being thrown at it all the time by the public. And that's where a lot of the frustration came. So things like the crime, the youth stuff, a lot of other stuff like that, planning. So, I'd go to these big meetings where you had the capital city Lord Mayors was one of the most fascinating aspects for this for me. And in 2009, I was chair of that group. So you had Campbell Newman from Brisbane and Clover Moore from Sydney and Michael Harbison from Adelaide, Lisa Scafidi from Perth, a whole bunch of quite, high-profile people working on issues together.
Yep.
And that sort of stuff was fantastic. And we set up a lobbying process in Canberra. It's funny, actually. We spent a lot of nights out on the red wine with Anthony Albanese during that period, because he was the minister under Rudd's government that was sort of dealing with the infrastructure and stuff, which was a big part of the push that we were doing. But fascinating time and learned a lot. But talking to all those people, one of the really key things that allowed them to influence the structure of their cities and do some of the key things that they were doing was their planning powers.
Right.
And we don't have those in local government up here.
Yep.
And you have this sort of weird divorcing of that. And I'll never forget being at a huge summit in Sydney. We had, so this was expanded out from capital cities to major cities, so the 20 biggest cities in Australia or local government areas. The feds, a bunch of other government people, the police and stuff in this big conference talking about nightclubs and violence and alcohol and crime and assaults and all the rest of it.
Sure.
And there was a huge amount of information in there about how all of this strategy they were working on was working to change the outcomes of a lot of this stuff. And I looked at Brendan Dowd, who was the CEO at the time, and said, you know, mate, we're the only jurisdiction in this room that can't go back to our day jobs tomorrow and do anything about this. But secondly, the only jurisdiction in the country that works in this space that's not here is the Northern Territory government's alcohol mob. And it came out later that they'd been, this staggers me, the stupidity of this, but they'd been caught up in that push about competition. So the idea back in these days was that competition was a good thing. And so the idea that you'd have more bars is improving competition.
Right.
The idea that you would have happy hours and stuff with cheap grog for a couple of hours is sort of improving competition.
Yep.
And yet all the national advice and everything is don't go there.
So what's the
And
logic
that's where
behind
we're going.
What's the logic behind more competition? Is that it's going to spread the punters, or
Well,
how does
that was sort of the theory, but like it was just a general flick over from the business stuff where the competition watchdogs and others were pushing competition as an issue, and the Northern Territory was being hammered by it because they were not really facilitating competition in key areas like power and others.
Yep.
Partly because we were so small and partly because it's all government controlled. But the point was the message you got through in that space in completely the wrong way and was leading to exactly the opposite outcomes to what you would want if you were managing this from an alcohol perspective.
Right.
So things like cramming all of your alcohol venues into one little space
Strip,
is
yeah.
a nightmare disaster area.
Right.
Whereas spreading it out around your city has lots and lots of other benefits.
Okay.
So there were all sorts of things like that that were not being looked at up here that were part of that national agenda because of the crazy way we do things up here.
So is that because we're a territory and we're not a state, or is it just the way our regulation and our legislation is structured? Do we need to restructure our local government, our state government? You know, is that
Yeah,
is
look, it's probably too hard, but it
reforms
definitely
needed?
needs to be looked at, because I think one of the big problems up here is that we're a unicameral parliament, so I mean there's only one house, which means there's very little review and there's very little process around analysing stuff. I mean, one of the crazy things that happened in 2016 when the Gunner government got elected was they killed off the scrutiny committees. And that was one of the last remnants of genuine ability to ask questions about and try and review proposed legislation. So legislation would go into the House, it would go to a scrutiny process for a period of time, and people could put submissions in, and you know, if there was stupid stuff in there, you could point it out.
Right. Was that something that was introduced by the Claire Martin government? Because she said she introduced estimates for that reason, for, you know, accountability and transparency.
Yeah, no, estimates were slightly different. I think scrutiny committees have been around for a long time.
Oh, okay. Right.
But they got rid of them because they didn't like the fact that when the fracking stuff came up in scrutiny committees, they couldn't answer the questions.
Okay.
And they were too hard, or what they were doing was so stupid. So it was just a way of avoiding that scrutiny. But the problem with it is that the vested interests that get into the party back rooms and other places, and that was where that capital city Lord Mayor's group setting up the lobbying process in Canberra. Like, we recruited and employed lobbyists to take this stuff into the debate around federal parliament stuff, and I was fascinated in the way they worked and the way they did things. And I was on the interview panel that selected the person. She'd worked for the Property Council of Australia, but you know, the gold standard in this space was the mining lobbies and the oil and gas industries.
Right.
And the way they work and the way they do things. Now, the alcohol lobby is the same. So they get into the parties and stuff in the back rooms. They influence the way we do things. So policies come out. which lead to perverse outcomes, and the community's going, how did that happen?
Mm.
And there's no scrutiny, there's no upper house, there's no mechanism in our parliament to twist that around and fix those little issues or point out this is going to cause this problem. And so that's one of our weaknesses in the NT, I think.
Yep.
And it's also one of the reasons why I'm standing as an independent in the next election, because I think independence can help make that happen, and just bring an extra layer of scrutiny to the way the government functions.
So would it be one of your policies to reintroduce that scrutiny?
Absolutely.
Committee, or?
I mean, the policies around a huge suite of transparency and responsiveness to the community and bringing back accountable government. And there's about 5 or 6 dot points on how you do that.
Okay.
One of them's fixing LOCAC. Other ones relate to... I've forgotten my train of thought now. So that process around accountability and stuff, there's ombudsman positions which are supposedly doing that, and they're not funded to the level where they can actually do their jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's silly clauses in the legislation, like what I call the corruption clause, which is in the Petroleum Act and other acts as well. So the Act says decisions under this Act need to be based on the principles of ecologically sustainable development. And then the very next sentence says, but in making decisions under this Act, the Minister doesn't have to publish their reasons for that decision.
Right.
So basically says you should do it this way, but we sort of know you're not going to, so here's the out. You don't have to tell people why you've come to that conclusion.
Right.
So that needs to change as well, because ministers need to be able to say, yeah, I want to do this, but they have to explain why. And then the third one is the fifth one, bringing back scrutiny committee stuff and making sure that's a genuine process where legislation does get reviewed by people and they can make comments and ask questions about it to try and sort out all the unintended consequences and the silly stuff that comes out of it.
Yep.
So, yeah, that's a key part of the platform.
Yep. So was that a culture you sort of tried to instill when in your time as Lord Mayor, more accountability, transparency, and, how did you measure that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I was quite proud of as Lord Mayor, before I became involved with council, about 11% of all their decisions were made in confidential, which is the government's and council's place to hide stuff they can't or won't talk about. And when I was mayor, that dropped down to 3.5% or thereabouts, because there was a commitment that this is about the community, for the community. They have an absolute right to know. Instead of trying to bury it and hide it, there's a few things that are commercial in confidence genuinely, and they needed to stay in confidential. Mm-hmm. But we also had a policy that when stuff had got past the point where the negotiations were done and the deal was going to happen, that would be absolutely taken out of confidential and made public, so everybody knew exactly what was going on. And one of the things I found most frustrating with dealing with the government on a lot of issues is that they didn't buy into that philosophy at all. So the Chief Minister's Department, and that seems to be this major marketing machine that just tries to snow and play with a perspective on stories, and from a marketing perspective, whether it has any bearing on reality or not. And one of the things that used to make me laugh but cry at the same time was this issue they went through with the Middle Arm Development Precinct, where last year there was a period where all the journos around town were trying to get the politicians to admit that it was a gas precinct, but they were insisting on trying to use the word Sustainable Development Precinct.
Right.
And they took the word gas out of every single document relating to it and stuff like that, whereas we all know it's a gas precinct. And the first thing they're going to try and do is build a gas plant there. Yep. And all that stuff. But it's the way the whole spin cycle has become with social media and modern era politics. Yep. And the counter to that is to have full and open transparency. So one of the really interesting examples of that is the Ombudsman report into the Steigerfauna fiasco, when they stripped the contract from CDU and gave it to some mob in WA. The Ombudsman's report into that said they did the wrong thing and did it in the wrong way, and that the result of it was that they ended up paying twice the amount of money that the uni was going to do the contract for, and that all of that money, except for about $4,000, left the Territory as a result. Right. Which breaches every principle the government supposedly talks about and whatever. Yep. So the Ombudsman's referred that to ICAC. I still don't think that's been through ICAC yet, because ICAC's got pressures and doesn't have enough resources and stuff. But, there needs to be a process where these bad, potentially criminal acts are exposed and people get held to account for it.
Yep.
And we don't have those processes in the Northern Territory at the moment.
So is that through strengthening things like ICAC?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
So strengthening and also giving them enough resources to do their job.
Sure.
So they don't have to say, oh, we can't do that one, or it's sitting on a to-do list that's probably getting longer rather than shorter. And making sure that there are proper processes around the responses to those things as well.
Yep.
So if something is found out and pointed out, that there's a mechanism to make sure it gets corrected.
So you've been able to navigate. It seems like you've been able to navigate your way through local politics, local government, and it sounds like you know where the problems lie in territory politics. How do you see your entry into, mid-tier government politics, and do you think it'll be any different to, navigating the bureaucracy and, that you experience at the local level?
Yeah, I mean, that's the million-dollar question. How do you get there, and do you get there, and when you do, how can you change it? And that's where it's quite a fascinating process at the moment. Like, I'd been pressured into doing this a few times in the past and always said no. And part of that was because it was party politics stuff, and I didn't have a fit with any of the parties. Like, I have a partial fit with all of them, basically,
right,
but not a full fit, so I wasn't comfortable with that. Secondly, I wasn't sure I wanted to do it. Then this community independent stuff happened with the Teals around climate change and other stuff at the last federal election. There'd been a lot of community stuff I'd been involved in. So I did a contract for a couple of years with Lock the Gate around fracking and other things, where I was doing research into the implications and the data and all that sort of stuff.
Yep.
And just being involved in community movements like the cane toad stuff and general environment stuff, the ongoing stuff we've been doing, gave me a real energy level, I guess, around community and what the community wants and needs. So the community independent movement sort of grew out of that. And there was a really interesting example just recently in Tasmania where the independents got the balance of power in the Tasmanian government. Mm-hmm. And some of the reports have come out of there in the last month or so showing that that's working fantastically well. And what I find interesting is working a bit like council used to work, where everybody in the room is sort of focused on the issue rather than party political lines.
Right.
And that's what I'm hoping we'll start to see if some of the independents get up in the next election.
Yep.
And, the reality is that I chose Wanguri partly because that's where I work and that's where I spend most of my time.
Yep.
But also because Nicole Manison's retiring. So that means there's no incumbency factor in that seat, which is, I know from studying politics. I did politics at uni. That's one of the biggest factors in the elections up here.
Yep.
So it was prime for it, but the main reason was the community independent movement was doing work and I was involved with a little bit of that stuff, and people were pushing me all the time. Go to Bunnings on Saturday morning and someone would say, are you doing it? Are you doing it? In the end, I came in and said, yeah, okay, I am. So there was lots of those sorts of reasons, but also my read at the moment is it's going to be a really, really close election.
Okay.
Everybody doesn't like both parties, so I think it'll be close. And there's a genuine possibility, I think, that independents will have a balance of power situation, and so some real change might be possible.
Right.
And not the change that the vested interests have been pushing inside the parties for the last forever probably, but certainly in the last decade.
Yeah. So it's a wide open race in your view. What do you know about the people that you're running against? I think is it Ollie Carson and Shlock Sharma?
Yeah, look, not a lot really, to be honest. I mean, most of the people I've spoken to don't know much about them either, and that's part of the thing. Like, it's a sort of an open race with three new people because Nicole's retired. I mean, she's obviously supporting Shlock, but that's part of the suck it and see type thing. You're like, I've got no idea what the community reaction will be. I mean, I'm getting a lot of positive feedback from people, but whether that translates into votes on the 24th of August and what comes out of that is one thing.
Yep.
The next thing is what happens across the territory in the general election. But
sure.
As I keep saying to people, if you're not in it, nothing's going to happen.
Yeah. So are you opening to joining or forming a coalition, or just staying independent and working?
Yeah, look, it'll depend. I had a funny chat with Jerry Woods the other day, and Jerry was in that situation and had been a fairly well-respected independent. Yeah, look, who knows? I mean, it's going to depend on on so many different things. It's going to be a fluid decision at the time.
Yep.
And I'm not going to rule it in or out, but it's a prospect that's, it's out there, and we'll see what comes out of this election campaign. Is going to be fascinating.
Yep. So crime's obviously going to be a massive issue for a lot of voters going into this election. I think I remember hearing you say we've got to stop being tough on crime, instead got to get smart on crime. What exactly does that involve?
So one of the things that fascinates me, and some background on this, I did a lot of work in this when I was in the Lord Mayor's job, and had the social workers in council do a whole bunch of stuff for us on trying to get an understanding of youth issues and where some of this was coming from, because this was a big issue way back then.
Yep.
And I then have been on the board of YouthWorks for a significant period of time as well, and seeing professionals that work in this space of getting young people, picking them up from where they're at and skilling them up for jobs, but
Yep.
more importantly, building their self-respect and self-confidence to the point where they feel like they can fit in and they can do this.
Mm-hmm.
And they've been spectacularly successful. So young people that you get sorted out like that and get into jobs don't commit crimes. So the evidence is around that education and these sort of things help stop the crime spiral. And one of the things that really hit me hard when my step-grandson Kingsley was murdered was that the police come and clean up the mess afterwards. They can't fix it.
Yep.
And it brought me back to a conversation I had with John McRoberts years and years ago when he was first appointed as police commissioner. And he said, look, to be honest with you, my police officers are not trained youth workers. They don't understand how, and they don't have the time, and their interactions with young people are not designed to help young people sort their problems out.
Yep.
He said, to be honest with you, by the time police are interacting with young people, it's too late. And so what Get Smart on Crime means is follow the evidence and start doing things that stop kids getting into that spiral where they're having to interact with the police and where they're doing stuff in the community and whatever.
Yep.
And we don't do that. Like, one of the things that really blew me away was Darwin City benchmarked itself against 20-odd councils around Australia of similar size. And on things like green open space, roads, rubbish, you name it, we were top tier. 1, 2 or 3 in most things, top 5 for nearly everything.
When was this, sorry?
2012.
Okay.
28 to 12 when we were in that process.
Wow.
When it came to youth facilities, we were 19th out of 20. And I was just looking at some stats the other day where since then the shack shut. That was one of the few facilities that was around in those days. So we've actually got worse. But the youth unemployment rate is worse. The percentage of young people in jobs as part of the workforce has decreased. And this is why I just get so frustrated with the government. Like, the Northern Territory government does not have funding for youth employment strategies. And yet groups like YouthWorks and others have showed that youth employment strategies are a really good way to get young people started in picking up the kids who have dropped out of the system or don't quite have the skills or confidence to take that next step and getting them through that next step.
Yep.
And to give you an idea of how successful, the Transition to Work program, which they implemented, which is federal funding,
Yep.
was basically paid on a bonus system. So if you were successful in getting a young person into work, you got a bonus payment.
Right.
If they were still in that work 3 months later and 6 months later, you got bonus payments.
Mm-hmm.
So when we started all this process, YouthWorks basically had no money. They've now got several $1 million in the bank
Right.
because they got so many young people into jobs.
Yep.
And these are young people that were identified as in that at-risk category where they're not really doing that well at school and they're not
Sure.
lined up.
Yep.
So the thing that I've learned out of all this and talking with the other agencies that work in that space is that there are solutions here. And if you look at the international literature and other things, there are strategies and things that actually help solve the crime problem by developing those younger generations and getting them into work and getting them to be participating members of society.
Yep.
Getting tough on crime and throwing kids in jail and putting them under punitive oppression
Yep.
does the exact opposite.
Right.
It hardens them. And my argument's this, that we've been doing Get Tough on Crime ever since I've been in the Northern Territory.
Yep.
And the outcome of that, if you look at it professionally, is exactly what we've got, where you're just making the problem worse and you're hardening attitudes and you're causing kids to become more and more anti their communities.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to break that cycle, and that's what I talk about: getting tough on crime, getting smart on crime instead of getting tough on crime.
Right.
And one of the things that really concerns me is Leah Finocchiaro is using the same terms, but when you actually read what she's proposing, she's just saying we're going to get tough on crime more,
Right.
and develop these punitive programs where kids are forced to do this and forced to do that and forced to do this, and places like Don Dale's, and we seem to have a competitive bidding war between the two parties on who's going to build the more prisons.
Right.
It's just mind-boggling to me that we have this really not smart conversations about dealing with really complex social problems that are a major, major problem across our community.
Yeah.
And if we don't do something about it that actually is going to work, it's going to continue.
So you're suggesting more of like an opt-in thing, having community services available that are available there for kids that are troubled, and that can sort of find these youth services that break the cycle before they sort of enter the criminal justice system. And,
absolutely.
And then it's a lost cause almost.
Yeah, look, absolutely. So one of the things is we want to do a new type of justice system.
Okay.
So a community justice system. And that will make decisions based around kids and their families and so forth that, this person's at risk, but we think they might benefit from doing something like the Youth Works program.
Yep.
So that'll be their sentence, for want of a better term, is to be enrolled and actively engaged in that. And if they don't, then they go back through the process and something else might happen. Or that kid might suit one of those outbush camps like the one that Frank Shadforth runs down at Borroloola, and a cultural experience thing that might get them back on the rails.
Yep.
This one's a really hardened case. They might be better off in Don Dale, or not Don Dale, because nobody's better off in Don Dale, but in a more controlled program like that. Because the other side of this that people don't realise, I think, is that the cost of keeping the juveniles in detention that we are is costing us $50 million a year.
Yeah.
If we can't build genuine solutions for that amount of money to get these kids back on the rails and sort most of them out, then something's really wrong, because I've seen lots of evidence these things exist. So that's a matter of the shift. And I mean, I just choked on my Wheaties when I heard that Eva Lawler was going to put $200 million more into police.
Right.
We've got the more police than any other place in the world.
Yep.
And it's not fixing the problem. So throwing more money at it's not going to fix the problem. I think it would be much smarter to put that $200 million into ancillary services to help the police.
Yep.
Short circuit this stuff and stop the kids interacting with the police. But when they do, diverting it into this sort of other area where there's a chance you're going to pick those kids up and fix them.
Yep.
But it needs to be managed and supervised, because it's not good enough to just put an ankle bracelet on a kid and let them go again.
Yep.
It just doesn't make any difference unless you've got people engaged with them and making change. And, that happens in community as well. I mean, I forgot the young guy's name, the one that caught the $1 million barra.
Oh, yeah.
That Stefanovic idiot on Channel 9 tried to ambush him with a question about the fact that he'd done something naughty when he was 16 or whatever and stolen a quad bike.
Yep.
Now, visualise what might have happened to him if they'd thrown him in Don Dale for that, and he came out the other end more hardened and more. So what happened was his family and the guy that owned the business had sort of come to this arrangement that he'd come and work for weekends and whatever. And now you've got a really nice, socially adapted member of the community who's growing into a fine young man from all reports.
Yep.
And that's where I see the difference between getting smart on crime and getting tough on crime. If you'd thrown someone like that in Don Dale, you'd probably have another rat bag to deal with and ongoing problems. So I think that sums up the strategy. We've got to do it differently, and there's stacks of evidence around the world that we need to do it differently, and what we're doing now is clearly failing.
So what about, addressing root causes? Because it almost seems to me like if you're at the stage where you need a youth diversion program, that's almost after the fact. So, what are the root causes here? Is it broken homes? Do we need to address that initially, or is the root cause something else in your mind?
Look, there's unfortunately multiple root causes, and like early childhood education and stuff. And when I worked in the education system, most of the kids that are in the risk categories for this stand out like sore thumbs from a pretty early stage,
right?
Because their family environment's not great.
Yep. Because you can't get an education if you're going home and mum and dad are on the drink, or there's violence around.
Or if you live in a house where there's 14 people and you can't sleep.
That's right.
All that type of stuff is a compounding factor. But there's so many issues in there that don't lend themselves to a fix in the short term.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas getting some of those kids and having people working with them, and their families obviously are pretty keen usually to help with that process once you engage with them, because a lot of the parents that I've spoken to are just completely frustrated with their kids. And I know from most of the parents I've ever spoken to, they get to points where they're really just at a wit's end as to how to deal with what their teenagers are doing.
Yeah,
it's pretty much a tradition in Western society, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, there's a reality there. Like, that's what makes me laugh at this idea that, kids don't go to school, you're going to find the parents. Well, I know parents who have dropped their kids off at school and the kids still don't stay at school. They disappear to Casuarina or whatever. So we just need to get real about some of these things, and all those issues have to be dealt with.
Yep.
And, there's systems in place to try and do that, but they're long-term. So some of this stuff's multi-generational too. Like, there's a bunch of Indigenous issues in this as well as poverty issues. One of the problems we've got at the moment is poverty and cost of living, and these groups in particular are way overrepresented in that area.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't fix all those sort of problems. But what I've seen is that when you get some of these kids engaged with them, start building their self-confidence, building that self-respect back up, it then flows over into respect for the community, and then you get them skills and jobs, and you've got a functioning and positive member of the community again. And it's hard work in that sense, and the skilled professionals working in that space I take my hat off to, because they're brilliant.
Yep.
But my point is, if you foster those people, give them the resources to do their job, you're going to get a much, much better outcome than what we've got now.
Yep. Well, I think the economy is probably the other hot button issue going into the general election in August. I think I've seen you mention cost of living and that sort of thing, and we're paying too much for energy prices. How do you propose to address that? Is it I think you were sort of you weren't complimentary on the Labor government, just to put it diplomatically, of their gas policy and things like that. What's your way through all that?
I just spent a couple of years now as the chairman of the board of the Business Enterprise Centre.
All right.
And prior to that, I spent a lot of time as the chairman of the board and on the board of the Retail Business and IT Training Advisory Councils, which are all designed to interact with the business community and work out what they need. And one of our key problems is the small business community is just often ignored by government, left out of this,
I agree,
and not talked about.
Yep.
So one of the real important things, I think, is to get that focus back. So I think it's 99.8% of the businesses in the Northern Territory are SMEs.
Right.
And they employ 50% of the population.
Yep.
And then 42% of the population is employed in government and services. So this is everyone pretty much. And yet, in terms of economics, if you looked at what the government are talking about, you wouldn't think that existed.
Like they're catering to big business.
Catering to the big boys, the big end of town.
Corporate
and
interests, yep.
Most people, I think, got a pretty clear picture of some of the risks of this with impacts. And the damage to the tourism industry and the damage to a lot of other industries and stuff wasn't really acknowledged until after the fact, but they're significant issues. And the boom-bust cycle stuff does enormous amounts of economic damage to your cost structures in your business and your cost of living stuff. So,
Yep.
Electricians that get used to ridiculous hours of pay rates when they're doing impacts type stuff.
Yep.
When they come back to the real world, they think, well, hang on, I want to get paid more than this. So your inflation of cost is really bad.
And the flow on is like, briefly inflated property prices and
Everything.
Yeah, everything goes
destroys your markets, so many things. And one of the things that gets me about this is if you look around the world, there's time after time after time when there's a lot of hoopla about big oil and gas projects and none of the benefits deliver. If anyone's got concerns about this, they should go and read the Ohio River Valley Institute in the US documented what happened in their neck of the woods when the big boom happened there. And the net result was that their state's GDP was about half what the national average was. They lost population out of the counties where this actually happened, and all the things that we see in other places repeated there. But their Royal Commission sort of documented it.
Yeah.
And here we are talking about doing basically the same thing. Both parties think that we've got this big future in gas. Well, I mean, the other day I was reading the International Energy Agency's reports. So they're tipping in 2026 that the supply-demand situation is going to flip, and you're going to have a demand-driven market rather than a supply-driven market, which means price competitiveness becomes the key driver.
So what's the mechanism that allows that to happen?
A lot of supply coming on board, particularly from Qatar and America.
Right.
And
supply of what though?
Gas. So what's scary is that gas is between 30 and 50% cheaper than our gas, particularly the Beetaloo. Like, we've got a split between the conventional offshore stuff that Santos and Impex are doing,
yep,
and what they're proposing for the Beetaloo. So we're way out of the ballpark in terms of cost competitiveness. Now, anyone who knows anything about economics knows that when you're in a demand-driven situation, price becomes an issue.
Mm-hmm.
They're then saying in 2030, worldwide demand is going to start to decline because a lot of the countries have got their climate commitments starting to kick in around 2030.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're putting massive investment into renewables and stuff, which is starting to impact already if you look at the data around the world. In places like China, you know, people say China's bad, they're building coal-fired power stations or whatever, but
yep,
there was a report the other day that was showing that across, I think it was 22, I can't remember exactly now, but China spent more money on renewables than the rest of the world put together.
Mm.
And they're making these transitions. And I went to a thing in Växjö in Sweden in 2010, Greenest Cities on Earth Summit. And the World Business Council gave a talk at that where they said all of their big players are involved in this massive race to decarbonise production and at the same time to get as cheap as possible energy source under production, because they know the people who crack that are going to be the big companies of the future.
Mm-hmm.
So that is happening at a pace around the world, even though a lot of people will tell you different. But if you go and look, it actually is, and that's what the International Energy Agency and these other organisations are showing,
yep,
AMIO as well. The fact is, if we try and underpin the next stage of development of the Northern Territory on gas, particularly Beetaloo gas, we're
yep,
dead. We'll be stuck in the rut of not having a competitive economy for the next 50 years like we have for the last 50.
Yep.
The only thing that can break us out of that cycle is renewables. And one of the weird things about that is that the Northern Territory has one of the best renewable energy coefficients of anywhere. So we've first time ever got a competitive advantage around renewable energy, and yet we're thinking we'll do it with oil and gas. And it just doesn't make any economic sense to me at all. And then, of course, you throw on top of that the environmental, social and so forth things that seems really strange. But I know how state capture works and how the lobbyists work, and
yep,
that explains quite a bit of this. But I just see it as a huge economic risk to Darwin to think that we can make this work. I mean, I don't think there's anything on offer in the death throes of the fossil fuel industry that's going to propel our economy into the future.
Yep.
And, you know, I'm really worried that these huge amounts of money they're talking about will become stranded assets and will just become a complete waste. Now, that's not to say we don't have to look at some transition stuff, and I'll be proposing a gas reservation policy for 9%.
So gas is a transition fuel in your mind? Is that how you see it?
In a firming fuel to cover over some of the needs. And, like, we don't need much of it. And, unfortunately, we need more of it now than we should because our government's been so useless in the past. So those 3 solar farms that we've got sitting out there that aren't connected to the grid, I mean, that's just the biggest travesty. And that's all because they didn't put the investment in.
Can you explain that a little bit, just for
So what's
less
happened
technically?
is you've had 3, at least, and I'm not sure whether there's more,
Yep.
people build significant solar farms and they haven't been allowed to connect them into the electricity grid because the grid's not set up in such a way to handle it. And so basically things like batteries.
Were they expecting the grid to be
Oh, absolutely they were. I mean, these people made these investment
upgraded?
decisions
Yep.
thinking that they were going to be able to sell electricity into the grid.
And was that based on government advice?
Well, they thought it was.
Right.
Yeah, and they've been short-circuited and they're quite disappointed and annoyed at that. But also from a perspective of us, we've missed out as a community because if that had been done, we would be having all this cheap energy input.
More competition.
into well, not only more competition, but all this cheap energy going into the system, which we're paying for in our power bills.
Right.
And then you see things like the 75 million they were talking about the other day that we're going to have to pay for extra gas because the E&I well in Blacktip's not working properly and all these other problems.
Yep.
But the reality is that we've missed a lot of the things that should have been done to date. Like I can remember when they first announced that big project at Tennant Creek, Cannon Brooks and Co.
Sun cable.
Power to Singapore.
Yep.
And, you know, that was poo-pooed by the politicians like Gunner and Co. Initially they thought, we're not into that. We're on Beetaloo gas. That's where we're going. And now you think, oh, maybe that was a smart move. And they're now going to try and hook that into the Sustainable Development Precinct and use renewable energy to power this place. But they're still mucking around with fossil fuels and other things which are going to price you out of the marketplace as a lot of these new technologies come in around green energy. So what we should be doing, in my view, is with some of the rhetoric we're hearing about that place, we should be doing what the rhetoric actually says, not what it means.
Yep.
The government's doing this as cover for a greenwashing for a gas project. And if they do that, it'll be a disaster. I mean, you saw the other day the pollution issues around the VOCs coming out of the Impex plant, you know, thousands of tonnes. Those sorts of issues are documented all around the world. When you build these big gas precincts, you get cancer alleys and all sorts of other problems. And I don't think the social licence for this, but also I think people are really concerned about what the economics of this might mean into the future. And that's my big concern, that the economics just don't make sense. And I know that when we were working with the report that came out of the Business Enterprise Centre, the small businesses that we were talking to were sharing that concern enormously, that they didn't think this was a smart economic move. So the Turk report and stuff they thought was missed the ball. And so that's one of our big challenges, I think, is to get that debate opened up so that people understand that this is not a panacea. I mean, the big companies that are, you know, some of the things the Australia Institute have uncovered in their research, that the nurses in Australia pay more tax than the fossil fuel industry. You know, I mean, that's when you actually sit and analyse, that is staggering stuff. And then you've got the one where they put out the HEX stuff. So, you know, the Sovereign Wealth Fund in Norway is this massive investment fund that's been built out of fossil fuel royalties.
Yep.
It pays for education, pays for health. In Australia, we get more revenue from HEX debt than we do from fossil fuels. So, like, you couldn't get two more perverse differences. And yet we're one of the biggest suppliers of fossil fuels in the world. And that's got to change in that firming period when we do have to transition through.
Yep.
And I can see a minimal role for conventional gas, no role for fracking gas.
Yep. So the detractors would say to that, can you run a manufacturing economy, for example, on just renewables, solar panels, wind, that sort of thing with battery backup? Is that possible?
Yeah. And I mean, that's what the experts are saying all around the world. It's going to take some work to do it.
Is there examples currently of that?
Well, according to the experts, there is, and I mean, I haven't been to see them, but that's part of the issue here. And if you listen to people like Twiggy Forrest and that, they're making massive investments down that pathway, and there's still some work to be done. But my point is, I don't believe in 10 years' time you'll be able to sell products that are using gas as your baseload energy source or as your feedstock, because you'll be pricing yourself out of the marketplace in Australia. So the Beetaloo gas is going to be some of the most expensive gas in the world.
Why is that?
Well, it's so hard to get at.
Is
so
it really,
far away.
Is it deep or something? Or?
It's hugely deep.
Yeah,
like
right.
They're spending mega millions of dollars for every well they drill.
Yep.
And they're not getting super fantastic returns. Like it was the Shenandoah stuff that Tambourine are playing with at the moment. It's the first one ever that's really produced a near commercial or commercial flow. And it's still mid-range from what you'd be hoping for.
Yep.
So that makes it all expensive. It's a long way away. They've got to get it to Darwin, so that means a pipeline, which is huge more expense. Then they've got a carbon capture and storage issue for it, which makes another layer of expense. And if you read the CSIRO reports and stuff, carbon capture and storage with gas and stuff is way more expensive than renewables with backup.
Is that just because carbon capture is a real infant technology? Is it going to get better in your mind, or?
There's a famous quote somewhere from the chairman of E&I, who's a big Italian company that also supplies our gas, It's saying when you're looking at new technologies, you give it 10 or 15 years, and if it's not showing any promise, then you forget it.
Yeah.
And he said, we've been mucking around with CCS for 20 years and it's never delivered.
Right.
Though there's a lot of people out there saying it will deliver, but if you look at the examples, there's hardly anywhere in the world where it's working. And, you know, you look at the big Woodside failures in WA where they've been spending billions on it and trying to make it work, and they haven't been able to get it to work. And you think, well, okay, if after 20-odd years it's still got that many problems, but even if it does work, it's going to be expensive, you can't afford to add that onto your energy source that's your base for your manufacturing. And it's all very well for governments to say, oh, we can subsidise it, but you can't. I mean, you just can't keep throwing subsidies at this stuff. So unless you get that clear, in my mind, that our medium to long-term future is renewables, and if we don't have renewables, then we're cooked, literally, because the climate change stuff will cook us too. But the whole point is, if you're looking at a manufacturing and production base, and I support things like the critical minerals and other things that we might do in this space. Some limited stuff in the next little while with offshore conventional gas processes, because that's much cheaper. Because, as I said with the Beetaloo stuff, you know, you've got to drill thousands of wells at millions of bucks each. And this is one of the reasons why these companies never end up paying royalties, because they write off all their production costs before they pay anything.
Right.
So you look at INPEX.
So it's a loophole, is it?
Absolute loophole. INPEX of $42 billion that they've generated in revenue in the time they've been there.
Yep.
They've paid 0.3 of 1% in tax, no royalties, and no PRRT. So they've basically been given a free gift of all that gas, $42 billion worth, and put nothing back into the community.
That's the Commonwealth, isn't it? Isn't that
largely because it's offshore?
It's offshore, So, I guess we can't blame our local government as much.
Well, we can, because they're the ones who are not advocating for something out of this.
So they should have been lobbying harder, the feds.
They should have been. Instead of hanging the hat out and saying, yeah, guys, you can have whatever you want, just come here.
Yeah.
They should have been saying, well, there's got to be something in this for us. And, you know, there's the gas plant and the jobs and a few of those sort of things, which is sort of okay, but they're no different in terms of their economic benefit to all the other jobs around Darwin as well, in terms of people getting paid wages and spending them in their community and whatever.
Yeah.
And then when you see things like those VOC reports showing all the cancerous emissions and stuff that are happening, you think, well, hang on, where's the offset reward for taking all these risks as a community? And so the whole thing just doesn't stack up, because these, and what makes me angry is if you look overseas at Norway as an example, they do pay their way, and they have put a huge amount of money into this investment fund, which has set up their communities forever. So here we are saying we can't fund the hospital, we can't do this, we can't do that because we don't have any money. And these guys are walking away with billions made out of our gas. It just doesn't make any sense.
Does Tamboran sort of remedy that in some respect? Because I guess they're drilling on territory land where we have more control over the...
Yeah, Eva Lawler won't tell us what the royalty arrangement is.
Right.
And I'm sure that's because it's not good. Like if you look all around the world and look at all the other examples in Australia, the amount of money that's been coming out of these projects is a pittance into government revenues.
Right.
And that's because the taxation systems and stuff that have been set up are really bad, but also the principles around being able to write off all your expenses before you do anything around paying compensation. Like one of the things we need to understand is the feedstock that goes into these things are a non-renewable resource. So the principles of ecologically sustainable development says that if you're using a resource that's not going to be available to future generations, you need to compensate for that. And that's where the principle of the Sovereign Wealth Fund comes from. Brilliant example.
Yeah.
We don't do it. And that's got to stop. Like these guys get free business inputs. Wish I got free business inputs into my business.
Yeah.
So the gas supply that comes into the plants, it's estimated that 9% of that gets burnt in their energy plant to chill, liquefy the rest, right?
Yeah.
So they're talking about moving to renewable energy for that process because they recognise it's...
Is that blue? Do they call it blue instead of green?
Well, if they do that sort of stuff, yeah. Because they're still using gas as feedstock.
Yep.
But they're doing that because they want to sell that 9%. So my argument is that 9% of saved gas needs to become the reservation gas to the Northern Territory and to Australia to use to drop our energy costs and set up our manufacturing through the renewables era and act as a firming fuel for the few years for the amounts that we need, and Unfortunately, we need a bit of that because we've stuffed up the transition so far.
Yep.
But as we get on top of that and things happen, that gas can be whatever. But, that's our gas. We're giving it away to someone who's not giving us anything back in return, which I find quite alarming.
In terms of what you just spoke about, does if say that a Tamboran, instead of putting that 9% in their pockets and into a sovereign wealth fund, does that 9% potentially make that sort of project uneconomically viable? Is that sort of what's holding back?
Yeah.
If I've got to give some of my profits over to the state, then it's not worth what we're doing. And is that sort of the same sort of factors that allowed an Impex to come to Darwin instead of off the coast of Western Australia because there was no real contribution to the local economy? Is that sort of how you see it?
Not completely, not at 42 billion profit. And I mean, this is the problem. Like, these guys are making mega profits at the moment.
Yep.
So Tamboran's different. That's why I always make a distinction between conventional gas and frack gas.
Okay.
I don't think that, like, if you read the Pepper report, their prediction was that frack gas would get a little bit of a start and then it would fizzle out.
Right.
And I would say that that's looking more and more likely right now because all of the economic indicators are that gas is becoming less and less important in terms of people's medium and long-term energy plans. But in that transition period, as that transition happens, price is going to be the key driver. And our gas is 30 to 50% dearer than anybody else's.
Right.
And I would suspect that, given that that's a national figure, that the actual Beetaloo frack gas is probably 50% dearer than anybody else's.
Right.
So, if you're a good marketing guru, maybe you can sell your product at 50% higher than anybody else's, but when it's a standard commodity that's the same as Joe Blow's, I don't think that's going to work. And if you're using that gas to underpin a production process, like making fertiliser, you're still up against the same problem. You're going to have a commodity that's not price competitive with other people. And that's what I see as a huge risk of doing this big development. If you do it that way, it's going to be a stranded asset. You're going to waste your money.
Where do you see things like, first of all, hydrogen and then nuclear play into this? Both could sort of be considered, nuclear is always nuclear. Was it fusion or fission is always one of the two is always 10 years away.
Yeah.
And then I think you could probably say the same thing in a lot of respects for hydrogen. You talked about carbon capture before. Give it 20 years, and then if it's not viable, then you sort of got to leave it in the dust. Is that sort of how you see those two technologies, or is there a different role for those two technologies to play?
Yeah, look, I just dismissed nuclear before we start. Like, it's way, way, way too expensive. And I can't understand why we keep coming up with these ideas for energy sources which underneath it have a long-term major pollution problem. So we're just dealing with that now with carbon dioxide and the whole climate change scenario. And everyone says, oh yeah, we can deal with the waste from nuclear reactors and so on and so forth. Well, they're still sitting it in stockpiles in plants waiting to move it somewhere. And then what happens if it,
ruptures or...
And why are we taking that risk for a technology that's way more expensive?
But is that older technology where
no, they all make nuclear waste.
Yeah.
But the new ones are supposedly a lot better. But then all the research is showing that it's going to take years and years and years to do this, and it's going to cost a lot more than the renewables are. So my suggestion is, by the time we get to that point, so 10 or 15 years down the track, if we haven't fixed these problems and got this stuff sorted out, then we're in real strife. Because the climate change stuff's not going away. And if you look at the latest projections and stuff, 1.5 degrees is a fantasy. We're heading for 2.4 or 3.5.
Yeah.
And, the prediction that Darwin is not going to be livable by 2070 is going to have to come back. Like, that was based on 1.5. So 2070, less than that. So in a generation, you're going to have massive problems. And I'm hearing this from people already. Yesterday was 33. People are using their air conditioners in the middle of the dry season. And this is part of the resilience thing and getting ready for climate change. If we're going to need to use our air conditioners a lot more, we're going to have cheaper energy to do it.
Yep.
Otherwise, you're just not going to be able to afford it. So all those things come back to a renewable energy source underpinning this, which gives you a cheaper energy thing. Otherwise, people will be opting out of the grid and going to self-contained solar and batteries. It's difficult a bit at the moment, but all the trends and all the experts are saying, yeah, we can do this. So I haven't followed it up, but there was a report months back now of Townsville building one of those potential energy systems where you have a tower, it hoists weights up in the air during the day when you've got excess energy, and then it drops it at night when you need the turbines running. You know, people don't talk about those sort of things because they're not seen as some sexy new innovation. But in terms of producing baseload energy when you need it, they look like they're the go. And there's Norwegian companies and stuff that won the contracts to build these things, and they're happening around the world.
Yep.
So maybe that's a solution. I haven't even heard that mentioned in the Northern Territory. So there's lots of technologies and stuff coming out, but all the experts I've been able to see are saying that, yep, we can do this.
Including hydrogen? Where do you see hydrogen fitting?
Yeah, look, I think hydrogen's going to be an important part of it. And one of the things that's interesting is Toyota and some of those people have got some pretty significant hydrogen systems coming into play.
There was CIC, I think they opened an office in Darwin and they want to get involved in the Middle Arm precinct. Do you know anything about CIC?
No, not particularly, but I mean, a lot of these things have been mooted.
Yeah.
But when you look at it, there was a fancy aeroplane being showcased the other day that was hydrogen fuel cell driven.
Yep.
Executive jet. Looked perfect for the sorts of stuff. And there's reports that electric aeroplanes and some of these hydrogen fuel cell based systems are going to drop the cost of aircraft by 70%. So, you know, you look at all the stations out there now that have got a Cessna or a whatever, and they come to Darwin in the remote community travel and stuff like that, which costs you an arm and a leg. What happens when there's electric aeroplanes doing that sort of stuff and the cost of it had disappeared almost? The potential for that to open up the territory and do things. And, you know, remote Indigenous communities have got a massive cost problem. So I know my friends at Gapwerk and stuff, the cost of buying a bottle of milk and other things and just ridiculous.
Yep.
And that's part of the problem is the costs. But when that Marlinger microgrid was announced the other day, they were predicting that energy costs in that community might drop by 70%. So all that extra money becomes available then for whatever the community wants to use it for. But they were also looking at selling electricity into the grid, which they can't do at the moment.
Yeah.
So you've got all these economic development prospects and possibilities for getting a cheaper cost base underneath stuff and some real economic growth in remote places and stuff as well, all coming back to this idea of using a renewable source, whether it's hydrogen, and we're talking green hydrogen here, etc. So I don't understand why we're not spending more of our energy and attention in chasing that dream rather than a dead-end tunnel that's gas.
So do you think the biggest thing holding us back is this grid stability? Like if we improve the whole grid of all of Australia, and then these renewable technologies can just basically plug in and away you go, is that sort of the major impediment stopping us at this point, or is it the most fixable, or how do you sort of see that?
Well, one of the things that annoys me enormously up here is that we haven't done anything in that space. We're talking about it now and we're getting a battery in place, but you know, put it to you as a proposition that if all the money that we wasted in supporting the oil and gas stuff, and when I say wasted, like the Pepper inquiry said that the industry should be paying for all this stuff, not us. So the government's put, and I mean, it's hard to get the numbers exact because it's buried in various things in budgets, but I think the Australia Institute estimated $89 million was spent on that, and it was probably a heck of a lot more.
Right.
Now, if that had been put into renewable storage, like batteries and whatever things, then those solar farms could have been turned on. And it wouldn't have solved the problem entirely, but it would have started us down the pathway. Now, you look at the South Australian examples at the moment, and they have multiple days where energy costs are almost zero because the wind and solar stuff works really, really well for periods of time. And obviously there's a firming issue around that. But, you know, these are the technologies that scientists all around the world are saying, well, we've solved it. If you read the AMIO reports, and they're the authority on this stuff, they're saying that we're on track for this and that it's cheapest and that therefore we should be pushing harder. And, you know, the NT is isolated from the national grid in that respect.
Yep.
But I can't see why that can't be changed eventually. Like if you can run a cable to Singapore, surely you can run one to Sydney, or don't even have to get to Sydney, just to join up with the grid wherever it's closest. But that issue aside, if we can get that renewable stuff in place, then we've got a real future. If we don't, we're just scrabbling around with the chooks going nowhere.
So the territory more broadly, how do you see us placed at the moment? Are we in a good place or are we in a bit of trouble? Has the place changed dramatically, since you first arrived here? What are our competitive advantages going forward? There's how are you seeing the Territory currently, and are we in a position to coast, or do we need to sort of really make things happen in the next few years?
Yeah, look, we're in real trouble, I think, in lots of ways, but there's always been this thing about the Territory and opportunity, the land of opportunity.
Yep.
Some of it's fake, some of it's real. And I think when you look at the energy stuff, it's real. Like, I remember going through all the periods when we were marketing ourselves as a gateway to Asia, and we were this, that and the other, and none of it never happened.
Yep.
Even though geographically it's there. And one of the reasons it didn't happen was because there was all this enormous cost issues underneath it.
Tyranny of distance.
Yep. Freight costs, whatever. But,
Yep.
When you look at the critical mineral stuff, we had the lithium stuff started up down in Berry Springs and stuff down there, and then they sort of fell over a bit, still sort of ticking but not great, largely a cost issue. So, we've got to get the cost of production and other things sorted out, and this cost of living thing that pushes everything up in the Territory, we call it the tyranny of distance, but some of it's not necessarily real. And if we can get the energy stuff that underpins all of this stuff, like it underpins your costs at home, it underpins the business production costs in a business, it underpins the manufacturing costs in a manufacturing process. If you can get all that stuff competitive, then we've got real opportunities. But we don't seem to be moving down that pathway. And I think that's one of the big lessons, is trying to work with the natural competitive advantages we've got rather than trying to invent ones that actually aren't real.
Yep.
But in terms of critical minerals and stuff, there's a lot of work to be done. And people are just going with the soft option, thinking that gas is going to be the solution. Like, a couple of years back, the gas stuff was looking really dodgy. And then Putin did his little stunt in Ukraine and created a hell of a mess, and that's just totally distorted the world markets. So if those things go back the other way, then gas is going to disappear out the back door quite quickly, I think, along with other things, because the climate change stuff, when you look around the world, is scaring the hell out of governments everywhere, because we've had some problems in Australia, but they're nothing when you look at some of the problems we've had in Canada and America and China and some of the third world places. Now, if those things keep getting bigger and worse, then there's massive implications globally. And the governments are working very, very hard to fix that. And the oil and gas industry is working very, very hard to stop the governments. So it's going to be a really interesting 10 years.
Well, Graeme, that's all the questions I've got, mate. At the end of each podcast, we like to give our guests the open floor to just spruik whatever they've going on. If you wanted to have a final word to the voters, mate, the floor is yours.
Look, one of the things I think is really fascinating at the moment is the role that independents are being able to play in parliaments around the country. And I think there's a real opportunity for the NT to get some common sense back in the government and to fix some of the problems with processes and transparency by getting independents more engaged with the political process. So I really urge people to have a serious think about these issues and to go and have a long and hard look at the independents that are standing in their electorates, particularly ones who have come out of the community independence movement.
How do you see the legacies that, like a Jerry Woods, like you said, and a Kezia, as independents have left? Have they been effective in their time in government?
Yeah, look, I think in some parts they have, although one of the problems with them as independents is most of the independents we've had in the past have all come out of a political party.
Bigger parties, yeah.
And they've had a falling out with their party
Sure.
and been booted out and then stood as an independent. That said, they've used that independence to various degrees.
Yep.
And, there's quite a bit of difference, and that's one of the reasons why I said the community independent stuff, because the movement that's driving that, you've seen federally the Teal movement sort of as the epitome of that, and Cathy McGowan's Indi stuff, which is sort of the guiding principles now for this process that's rolling out across the country.
Right.
There's quite interesting outcomes in Tassie. I'll be fascinated to see what happens here on the 24th of August.
Graeme Sawyer, thanks for your time, mate, and best of luck with the rest of the campaign.
Thank you. It will be fun if nothing else.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone.